The story of Esther is one of the most famous in the Bible, and it is hard to find someone who does not know, at least superficially, this emblematic figure. After all, the story of the young Jewish orphan who lived in exile in Persia and, surprisingly, became the wife of the most powerful emperor of the time, certainly catches the attention of many people. However, Esther's story goes far beyond her ascension to the throne. She played a central role in the plan to free her people, the Jewish people, who at that time were under imminent threat of annihilation. But how did all this happen? How did a young woman of humble origins, belonging to the Jewish people, manage to rise to the position of Queen of Persia and become one of the most admired figures in the Bible? What aspects of her story are important to us? And why does her name not appear in any other historical source from the Persian period, other than the Bible? In this article, we will explore the true story of Esther and what we can learn from it. To fully understand it, it is essential to understand the historical context in which this story unfolded. The setting begins with the conquest of Jerusalem by King Nebuchadnezzar II, the Babylonian monarch, who took many of the citizens of the kingdom of Judah into exile in Babylonian lands. Among the exiles was an ancestor of Esther, who was taken as a prisoner to Babylon along with King Jehoiakim of Judah. This event, which marked the beginning of the Babylonian exile, was only the beginning of a series of significant historical changes for the Jewish people. Later, Babylon would also fall to the rapidly expanding Persian Empire, which would take control of the region. Following the conquest of Jerusalem, many citizens of the Kingdom of Judah were forced into exile in various parts of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Among these exiles was an ancestor of Esther, who was taken as a prisoner to Babylon along with King Jehoiakim, the monarch of Judah at the time. However, sometime later, Babylon also fell to the onslaught of the Medes and Persians, who established the Great Achaemenid Empire. The Persian Empire was led by notable historical figures such as Cyrus the Great, his grandson Darius I, and his great-grandson Xerxes I, who is identified in the Bible as Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus' reign lasted from 486 to 465 BCE, and it was during this period that the young Esther lived. Ahasuerus is described by historians as a powerful and ruthless king. Under his rule, the Persian Empire reached an impressive extent, encompassing territories from India to Ethiopia, and according to the biblical accounts, the empire was divided into some 127 provinces. Some scholars estimate that, in those days, the population of the empire was around 100 million inhabitants, of which approximately 3 million were Jews. The story of Esther is set in Susa, one of the three capitals of the Persian Empire, which served as an administrative center and also as the winter residence of King Ahasuerus, where he owned a luxurious palace. The story of Esther begins with King Ahasuerus calling a grand meeting of all his nobles, officials, military leaders, and princes from the various provinces of the Persian Empire. For 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the magnificence of his government, seeking to impress his subjects and allies with the splendor of his court. After this long period of displaying power and opulence, Ahasuerus organized a grand 7-day banquet, open to all the inhabitants of Susa, the capital of the empire. These banquets were a way of demonstrating the greatness of the empire and the absolute authority of the king. Many scholars believe that this event was actually a meeting called by Ahasuerus to discuss his military campaigns in Greece, since the third year of his reign was marked by such preparations. While King Ahasuerus was holding his banquet for the princes and officials in the palace, his wife, Queen Vashti, was holding a separate banquet for the women inside the royal residence. At one point during the celebration, the king, probably wanting to display his wife's beauty to all the guests, ordered her to come to him wearing her royal crown so that everyone could see her beauty. However, Queen Vashti refused to comply with this request. She probably realized that the king's order could put her in a dishonorable or humiliating situation. When Vashti refused, Ahasuerus became enraged and consequently removed her from her position as queen. After the king overcame his indignation, and perhaps because he missed his wife, his advisors suggested that he organize a selection of beautiful young virgin women from across the empire, to choose from among them a new queen. It was in this context that young Hadassah, a Jewish orphan, entered the scene. Hadassah, whose name means myrtle, a type of shrub, was the daughter of Abiel and was raised by her cousin Mordecai, a man from the tribe of Benjamin, descendant of Jair, Shimei, and Kis. Hadassah, who was also known by the Persian name Esther, was one of the many young women chosen to participate in this election that was looking for a new queen for the Persian Empire. All of the king's servants at the palace gate were ordered to bow to Haman, an important authority in the empire. Among those present was Mordecai, Queen Esther's cousin, who, for personal reasons and a principle of fidelity to God, refused to bow before Haman. This attitude was immediately seen as an affront, a disrespect that deeply hurt Haman's pride. Mordecai's contempt turned into something even darker, an anger that was no longer limited to a personal grudge, but took on an ethnic and spiteful character against the entire Jewish people. Haman, inflamed with hatred, decided that punishing Mordecai alone was not enough. He devised a diabolical plan to destroy all Jews in the Persian Empire without exception. Haman went to King Ahasuerus and, with cunning words, managed to persuade him to issue a royal decree to exterminate all the Jews in the empire, men, women, children, and the elderly, in a single day. As an incentive, Haman offered a large sum of money to the royal treasury, assuring the king that the elimination of these people would represent an economic benefit for the empire. The king, unaware of the implications of this decree, trusted Haman completely and bestowed upon him his royal ring, allowing him to seal the decree with authority. This decree was then sent to all the provinces of the empire, bringing a threat of imminent death upon the Jews. When Mordecai learned of the extermination plan, he was deeply distressed and immediately sought out Esther to warn her about what was about to happen. He asked him to intercede with the king to save his people. However, Esther was in an extremely delicate position. She could not simply go into the king's presence without being summoned, as this meant risking her own life, since Persian law stated that anyone who approached the king without his permission could be punished by death. Mordecai, aware of the gravity of the situation, reminded Esther that perhaps God, in his providence, had placed her at that time and in that position precisely so that she could save the Jews. It is worth mentioning that, until then, the king did not know that Esther was Jewish, and therefore had no idea that the extermination decree he had signed would directly affect his own wife and queen. Faced with this tense and desperate situation, Esther made a risky decision. She asked all the Jews of Susa to fast for 3 days while she prepared to meet the king. It was a gesture of faith and courage, as he knew his life was at stake. After 3 days of fasting and prayer, Esther dressed in her royal clothes and headed to the palace. Upon arriving at the inner courtyard, King Ahasuerus, sitting on his throne, saw her and, upon noticing her presence, extended his hand with a golden scepter towards Esther, signaling that she could approach without risk of punishment. The king, surprised by his boldness, asked him what he wanted, offering him up to half of his kingdom as a reward for his request. Esther then took advantage of this moment of favor and invited the king and Haman to a banquet she had prepared, a strategy that, she knew, could pave the way for revealing her request later. Esther, demonstrating great wisdom and caution, invited King Ahasuerus and Haman to a banquet she had prepared, creating an atmosphere of exclusivity and mystery. During that banquet, she asked the king to grant her permission to organize a second banquet the following day, at which she would make a special request of him. Haman, when included in this invitation, felt flattered and took the opportunity to boast of his growing status in the empire. He went home, full of pride, and shared with his friends and family the honor he had achieved by being invited to the royal banquets. However, his hatred of Mordecai and the Jews remained burning, and he continued to plan his revenge. Amid this atmosphere of triumphalism, Haman's family suggested that he build a large gallows for Mordecai so that he could finally get rid of him for good. But that very night, something extraordinary happened. King Ahasuerus could not sleep, and in his insomnia, he ordered that the historical records of the kingdom be read to him. During this reading, a passage caught the king's attention. It related how Mordecai had saved his life by denouncing a conspiracy against him, an act of loyalty that had so far gone unrewarded. This moment of divine providence was remarkable, for it occurred just as Haman was preparing to ask the king for permission to hang Mordecai. The king, surprised to learn that Mordecai had not been rewarded for his action, asked Haman what should be done to honor someone the king wished to reward. Haman, assuming that the king was referring to himself, suggested a grand celebration, with royal robes, a noble horse, and a public procession, in order to show the empire the great honor bestowed. However, to Haman's great humiliation, the king ordered that he personally perform this honor, but for Mordecai, the man he so despised. Haman was forced to honor Mordecai publicly, which left him deeply angry and humiliated. After this event, Haman returned home in a huff, but was soon summoned by the king's officials to the second banquet hosted by Esther. At the banquet, at the right time, Esther revealed to the king the truth about her Jewish origins and exposed Haman's deadly plot against her and her people. She revealed that Haman had persuaded the king to sign the decree of extermination against the Jews, without the king knowing that his own wife was part of the doomed people. Upon hearing these words, King Ahasuerus was enraged. He abruptly rose from the banquet and retreated to the palace garden, trying to process the magnitude of his betrayal. Haman, realizing that his situation had become irreversible, decided to stay in the palace and try to apologize, begging for his life before Queen Esther. However, when the king returned to the banquet hall, he found Haman slumped over Esther's couch, in an act that the king immediately interpreted as an attempt to assault or even commit violence against the queen. This act was considered a serious violation of protocol and royal honor, and in the king's view, Haman had exceeded all bounds of decency and loyalty. Thus, Haman's fate was sealed, and he was immediately condemned. When King Ahasuerus' servants saw the situation worsening for Haman, they realized that his doom was imminent and, in accordance with the protocol of the time, covered his face. Although this custom was common among the Greeks and Romans, in Persia it is recorded only on this occasion, which makes it unique. Haman was then hanged on the very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai, an irony of fate. Although the king's original decree authorizing the extermination of the Jews could not be revoked, Queen Esther, with her cunning and courage, managed to secure a new edict. This new decree gave the Jews the right to defend themselves and to attack anyone who tried to harm them, with the authority to destroy, kill, and annihilate their enemies. As a result, the Jews defeated their opponents and destroyed Haman's family. In addition, Esther obtained permission from the king to extend the period of vengeance for one more day in Susa, the city where anti-Jewish sentiment was strong. In all, more than 75,000 enemies of the Jews were killed. Although the decree allowed the Jews to plunder the goods of their enemies, they chose not to do so, a behavior that contrasted with the episode of Saul, in which the spoils of the Amalekites were taken, an act that contributed to his downfall as king of Israel. This episode in the story of Esther is also related to the origin of the celebration of Purim, an annual festival instituted by the Jews to commemorate the deliverance they had received. The people of Israel, on the brink of destruction, were saved thanks to divine intervention and the courage of Esther, and Purim became a way to remember this miracle. It is true that the historicity of Esther has been disputed over the centuries, especially due to the absence of her mention in historical sources other than the Hebrew Bible. Some scholars and theologians have even questioned the canonicity of the book that tells her story. However, certain historical details about the Persian court in Susa and Xerxes' campaigns against the Greeks seem to coincide with the historical context suggested in the Book of Esther, offering evidence that the account is not fiction. The most traditional position on the story of Esther, therefore, is that it is a genuine historical record, and that Esther's absence in other sources can be explained, among other reasons, by the fact that she was not the mother of the crown prince. This is undoubtedly a complex topic, with many arguments both for and against the historical veracity of Esther, and if there is interest, it could be interesting to explore this debate in more depth in a dedicated video. Most importantly, however, we should reflect on the great lesson that the story of Esther offers us. It is a powerful testimony to the sovereignty of God to accomplish His plans, even when His action seems invisible or imperceptible to our eyes. The Book of Esther, notably, does not mention God directly, and there are no extraordinary miracles recorded, but His providence is clearly revealed throughout the narrative. Even when events seem random or ordinary, it is possible to see the hand of God working behind the scenes, guiding circumstances in ways that lead to the fulfillment of His purposes. Often in our own lives, we may feel as if nothing extraordinary is happening or as if divine intervention is something distant and inaudible. Sometimes God's silence can challenge us, especially when we fail to perceive His action in our own daily events. However, the central lesson we can take from the story of Esther is that God's providence is always at work, even when we cannot clearly see it. Furthermore, the story of Esther teaches us the importance of trusting in God, even when it puts us in situations of great risk. It also reminds us of the need to act wisely in our decisions, always seeking divine guidance in our actions, especially when we are faced with challenges and decisive moments. Esther acted with courage, wisdom, and faith, trusting that God would guide her to save her people, and her example continues to inspire us today.